Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for another installment of a webinar that's put on by the Miami University Alumni Association. And we'll have a great and riveting discussion on the affirmative action decision that was handed down by the Supreme Court that had a visceral reaction from both sides of the issue. So we're going to give you hopefully a great discussion for folks to learn about what's going on from a national perspective, but also from the Miami perspective. So let's go ahead and introduce some of our guests here. We have Dr. Ronald Crutcher of the class of 1969. He's Professor Emeritus and Professor at the University of Richmond, and he's also President Emeritus of Wheaton College. We also have Dr. Walter Kimbrough of the class of 91. He is President Emeritus of Dillard University and of Philander Smith College. And we also have Bethany Perkins here, who is Assistant Vice President and Director of Admission, who will be sharing what Miami's plans are going forward. And also hosting our discussion is Dr. Rodney Coates, who's a professor of critical race and ethnic studies. And let's go ahead and kick it off, Dr. Coates.
First of all, thank you to the Alumni Association and you, Seth, for inviting me to this important conversation, particularly with such esteemed scholars as we have with Dr. Kimbrough and Dr. Crutcher. As we began, I wonder if each of you could take a few minutes and tell me about your journey from, I don't know, a student to president of a university. What was that like? How did you get there? You want to kick it off, Dr. Kimbrough?
Okay, sure. And so thanks for inviting me to participate. It really just started for me as an undergraduate, someone who thought he was going to veterinary school and actually went to veterinary school at the University of Georgia, and then decided I didn't want to do that, but I was very involved on campus. I had a national office with my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, and had a chance to interact with college presidents. And the president of Alcorn State, which is an HBCU in Mississippi, told me, he said, "You want to be a president, go get a master's degree in college student personnel services." And I didn't know what that was, but he had been president for over a decade, so I figured he knew what he was talking about. And so my last quarter at Georgia, I was at a grad fair. It was December. Well, it was October. I was graduating in December, and I was trying to find a place that had a student personnel program, and they had money for me to go. And I went to all the different tables, and people said, "Yeah, we got a program, but you can start in August." So I was like, "Oh, I don't want to do that." So the last table was Miami. And I knew a young lady who worked at Georgia Governor's Honors Programs with me every summer who went to Miami. And there was a Black woman who was the graduate recruiter at the table. I said, "Well, the sister at the table, let me at least stop and say hello and ask her." I said, "Do you have this program and do you have money for me to start?" And she said yes. And that's how I ended up at Miami. And Miami put me on the track. So Miami was very important for me in terms of understanding college student personnel and higher education. And so that was a foundation for me. And so that, I followed a student affairs career, which is not the normal path, but I think what I learned at Miami and that experience really helped prepare me. So that's the short answer. I put a lot of stock in Miami and Judy Rogers, and they did a great job with me in Miami.
Thank you. Dr. Crutcher, could you tell us about your journey?
Surely.
Well,
in a sense, I mean, my journey started at Miami as well, but in a little different way. There was a professor at Miami, Elizabeth Pottinger, who heard me play the cello in a competition after I've been playing the cello for about a year, and was impressed with how talented I was. And so she offered to teach me free of charge. And so at the age of 15, I would take the bus from Cincinnati to Oxford every Saturday, spend the entire day at Miami. Neither of my parents went to college. So in essence, I mean, Liz Pottinger guided us, me and my mother and my father, through that process. And as I watched her and what she was doing to change the lives of young people, including me, and she had a lovely home. She traveled. I thought, I want to be a university professor, just like her, playing the quartet. And that was my first motivation, to be an educator in higher education to help transform the lives of young people. And then many years later, when I was at the University of Texas as the head of the School of Music, I had by that time been an associate provost and vice president at a conservatory. My mentor, one of my mentors there, Bryce Jordan, and anybody who has gone to Penn State University to watch basketball games will have watched the basketball game in the Bryce Jordan Center. Bryce Jordan was the first musician to be president of a university, a large university. He took me to lunch one day and he said, "It's obvious to me that you're going to become a university president. Have you thought about the kind of school?" And I hadn't really, I think I thought about it at some point in time, but I hadn't really seriously considered becoming university president. So I said to him, not a place as large as the University of Texas at Austin, probably a small liberal arts college. And after the luncheon, I kept saying to myself, what motivated you to give him that response? So I went to the bookstore, looked in the education section and found a book called Colleges That Change Lives, 40 schools that change the lives of the students who go there, or something like that. As I looked at the introduction in the book, one sentence caught my attention. It said, "These are colleges that transform the lives of the students who attend them." And I thought, that's the kind of place where I want to become president. And I was fortunate enough to be president of two such institutions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stick with you, Dr. Crutcher, for a minute here. It is being a president of a university is hard enough, but being a person of color, a Black man in your case, at a PWI being the president, what was that like? Tell me about the challenges and successes, and what you had to deal with to be such a person.
Well, so I've been president of two somewhat similar institutions, small liberal arts colleges, although the University of Richmond is much more diversified than Wheaton was. And I'll talk about that in a second. But what I learned early on in the search at Wheaton, when I became a candidate, the only person on the search committee who knew that I was Black was Larry Bacow. He had been a mentor of mine, Larry Bacow, the former president of Harvard, who was on the Wheaton board. And so after my first interview, John Isaacson, the search consultant, called me and he said, the search committee thought you were fantastic. They really love you. But he said, they're wondering, is he really this good? Can he really be this good? And he said, you have to remember, this is a white group. They've never had a Black president before. And so those questions remain. He says, so the next time you come, I want you to demonstrate who the real Ron Crutcher is. Because at that point in time, this was like over 20 years ago, I have to be honest, I was much more formal and much more, I wasn't as open as I am now, as I've become. And so but his advice was very, very helpful to me because it caused me to think about, authenticity and presenting myself in ways that I had not thought about before. And then later on, when there were some issues with the faculty around an officer that I had to separate from the college, the faculty were very upset about it, and I had to explain to the board, because the board was wondering, why are they all this, why are they? I said, well, I'm a Black man at a predominantly white institution, and that the calculus is very different when you're a Black man in a predominantly white institution, and so I had to help them. I mean, it's not that they were not aware of it, but at some point in time, people, I think, when you appear to act like them, white people, forget that you are Black, that you appear as Black, and therefore there can be real challenges there. And my experience at the University of Richmond was different from Wheaton in a lot of ways, primarily because Richmond is in the South, in the capital of the Confederacy. And when I was recruited by the search firm to become the president, I was the only person that they were interested in. And so they brought us here on a secret visit. Betty and I really loved Richmond. We thought it reminded us of Greensboro, where we started out our marriage at UNC Greensboro. And and I have to say, the big difference between my experience at Wheaton and my experience at Richmond had to do a lot with the boards. The board at Wheaton, you may remember, was formerly a women's college. So our board was not only predominantly female, but very collaborative, cooperative, a much different feel. My board at Richmond was a Wall Street board, right? Primarily made up of white men from Wall Street. And this is an analogy I always make this is what I tell students, tell my friends. At Wheaton, when the board would go into executive session, they would thank me for my leadership and sometimes even literally applaud me. Never happened at Richmond. But at Richmond, every year I was president, I got a bonus. My friend said, well, that's their way of applauding you. But yeah, it was great that I got the bonus, but it was much more difficult at Richmond, particularly around issues of race, because I felt, as a Black man being president, the first Black president of this institution, that really, when I graduated from high school in 1965, I could not have gone to the University of Richmond. We didn't accept our first Black students until 1968. And so I felt it was incumbent upon me to help the university grapple with its racist past. So I developed this a President's Commission on University History and Identity. And thankfully, my predecessor, Ed Ayers, who is a renowned Southern historian, agreed to co-chair that committee. And it set us on a path that's still continuing, with a path through which we're reckoning with our racist past in real ways. And I'm very, very proud of that. But it was not easy. I mean, there were lots of headways. I'll give you just one example. There was one point at which I went to the board and I said to them, we know now from the research that has been done that our first president owned slaves. And while the university didn't own slaves, the university rented his slaves. And we have the records to show that. So therefore, we need to apologize publicly. Now, we had already apologized. Something else we learned in this commission is that we learned the location of a slave burial ground. And glory be to God, in January, everything goes as planned. We're going to break the ground for a beautiful memorial designed by a Black architect for that burial ground. But at any rate, when I presented, and so we apologized publicly for the burial ground. So I thought, okay, we ought to apologize for this. Well, the pushback was very strong. Oh, it would be an empty apology. We weren't there then. And the mistake, and I'm going to just say this publicly, the mistake that I made was I was floating this idea at the time, and I hadn't really made calls to board members. This is what I usually would do if I had an important issue to deal with. The long story short, eventually we got to the point where we did make a public apology, and the board, resoundingly supported that. But it's those kinds of things that you have to deal with. And by the way, after that conversation, as I sat there, and this was on Zoom, by the way, sadly, I sat in my seat and wondered, I have to say something to them. And so at the end of the conversation, I just basically told them why I personally felt that the apology was necessary. And I told them a little bit I shared a story with them about my grandfather. So it's been, it's been up and down. The big story is I am very proud of the contributions that we were able to make at both of the institutions. And if I were to be asked to do it again, I'd do either of them again, despite the ups and downs.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be back with you on some questions in terms of that. Dr. Kimbrough, I've just looked at some research, I think it was in the Chronicle a couple of days ago, and it indicates that 18 HBCUs currently are without presidents. I actually taught at an HBCU, Atlanta University, when it was separate in Atlanta. And I taught, and obviously I've taught at PWIs. I know that these are two different creatures and two different sets of challenges facing not only faculty, but particularly a leader. Can you tell me some of the challenges and successes you experienced as president of an HBCU?
Well, I always lead. I tell people that HBCUs are under-resourced institutions that serve under-resourced people. That's the bottom line. I feel like, they are some of the hardest jobs in America, which poses a challenge. The article about the number of HBCU vacancies, I was, interviewed by a reporter inside Higher Ed to talk about that. And I feel like sometimes people don't fully value, so sort of like Ron talked about people, questioning, was he really that good because he's Black? The same thing happens for HBCU presidents. If you're being considered for a majority institution where there is a lack of diversity, this is a pool of people that could help diversify predominantly white institutions, but then people sort of downplay what you do as an HBCU president. And I'm just like, I told people I would love for us to do sort of like a higher ed edition of Wife Swap, and let me take a semester at Harvard and let the Harvard president have a semester at Dillard or Philander. Let's see how they, give me the $50 billion endowment problems. Let me try to, like I said, there's some challenges there. The sister who's president, with all the things that are happening in the Middle East, yeah, she's catching it. It's different. But when you're talking about basics where you have students and families that come to you with tears in their eyes, like, I'm gonna have to go home because I don't have money, and all these other things that they're dealing with that gets dumped in your lap, it's a different kind of stress as well. So, but to be at two institutions that are under resourced, Philander Smith, we were really able to turn around. I was just proud about moving graduation rates. When you have a student population that's almost 80% Pell eligible, nationally, schools like that, your graduation rate is about 30%. We were able to go, 10 to 12 points above that. Same thing at Dillard. Dillard was able to get a graduation rate above 50% with 70% Pell eligible. So we were performing, as I tell people, outside of one standard deviation. So to be able to do those kinds of things, retention, graduation, move your alumni giving rates to above the national average. So there were a lot of ways to be successful in environments like that. So I'm proud of that work to be able to do that. But I mean, they are challenging jobs, and challenging, like I said, in a different kind of way, particularly being smaller institutions and more intimate, because you're able to develop some relationships with students. And sometimes they share. I always tell people, I always worry when a student says, "Can I come talk to you?" and they close the door, because you realize they're about to like bare their soul. And I've heard horror stories that it's like, okay, so what am I supposed to do with this? And you could just think like, that's not your job as the president. But because of the ethos of HBCUs, you become an extension in many parts, for students and their families. So you end up sharing that burden with them. So it's rewarding work, is draining too. But I mean, I wouldn't, I wouldn't replace any of those times I spent, in the 17 and a half years of those two institutions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you both know, recently the Supreme Court came out with a ruling against race-based admissions, and basically kicked out affirmative action. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Kimbrough, because many individuals do not understand that affirmative action impacts also upon HBCU. So can you tell me how you feel this will or will not impact upon HBCUs?
So there's I think a seminal quote that sums up this, and this quote is almost 100 years old. It goes back to 1928, a report that was done by Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who was the first African American president of Howard University. And in 1928, in this report, he wrote this. He said that, Negroes have to do a contradictory thing. They must insist that the doors of Harvard and Yale be kept open to Negroes, and at the same time build up Howard and Lincoln as if there were no Harvard and Yale. That's exactly where we are today, because people are trying to figure out what's the place of HBCUs in, this new world where you don't have affirmative action. It is, as I think some people have rightly indicated, the end of affirmative action doesn't impact the majority of higher education. It impacts those really selective institutions. But there still needs to be opportunities for those students to attend those institutions as well. So as Johnson said in 1928, I mean, we still have to fight that your Ivy League institutions are, open and accessible. But at the same time, we need to make sure we still fund HBCUs as if we don't have those options. So it is a contradictory thing. And people sometimes would think that HBCUs, might just be excited about it. There will be HBCUs that benefit from the end of affirmative action. Your upper tier institutions will, and they're already seeing it. The president at Morehouse said recently that, he doesn't have space for them right now. I worked at Morehouse last year. He didn't have space for the people who are interested in Morehouse now. That number is going to increase. So they're not going to be able to increase capacity fast enough to take those students. And then they'll have to decide, does Morehouse get to a size where it loses its fundamental character if it's more than 2,500 or 3,000 students? So those are the questions. Howard has had challenges with housing students. And so there will be a group that will definitely benefit because they're already competing with, the public Ivies, with the Miamis, with the Michigans. They're already competing with them. And so they might have some students who choose not to go to those institutions that in the past would have gone and still could probably get into those institutions, but are just saying the climate on that campus is going to change. I don't want to be there anymore. Let me look at an HBCU. So North Carolina A&T is all those places, but your small rural private HBCUs are not going to benefit from this. And people have to be realistic about that there won't be a rush of people going to those institutions. So that's going to be a part of so we'll have to see. I think in about 5 years, we'll have to do a landscape survey and see how this has impacted those institutions. The challenge, I think, for institutions like a Miami is, how do you recruiting good faith students, knowing that the laws have changed and your student body might change as well. So this becomes personal for me. I have a daughter who is a senior in high school. She can go anywhere she wants to because she has a 4.0 and 32 ACT. Okay, so affirmative action doesn't matter to her. And we're telling her when she tours these places to ask, what do you think this campus is going to look like in 5 years when she becomes a senior? Because it could be very diverse now and it might lose that character. So then her experience has changed over that period of time. And then she becomes this disgruntled alum because the campus doesn't look like the campus that she toured as a high school senior. That's going to be the challenge, that people really can't answer that question for her. And so for her now, she's like adding HBCUs to her list because she doesn't really trust. I mean, she liked Vanderbilt. She was there and visited, and, NYU and places like that. But I think she's now saying, I don't know what this is going to look like. And that's going to be the challenge for places like a Miami to say, how do you convince a student like that who can go anywhere they want to still make that choice when they might think that there are going to be fewer students that look like them and fewer faculty and no really senior level administrators. I think that's going to be the fundamental challenge.
Thank you very much. Dr. Crutcher, how do you think this ruling will impact upon PWIs?
Well, I think, since actually even before the Supreme Court announced their decision, PWI admissions people were having conversations about this issue. And in fact, I was just completed my my stint on the American Council of Education, on the Education Board. And in our last board meeting in April, my last board meeting, We spent half of the board meeting talking about this very issue, planning for the future. And in fact, Larry Backow was on the board still at that time, and he actually shared some of the thinking from the Harvard folks. So people are scrambling right now, quite frankly. As a matter of fact, next month, the very beginning of the month, I'm going to the University of California to facilitate a conversation amongst chancellors of University of California institutions, and they're inviting. This is co-sponsored by NATOHE. And they've invited people from around the country, I'm not sure whom they've invited. I'm assuming admissions officers to come and hear from the chancellors of some of the university campuses about some of the initiatives they put in place after Prop 109, which we know, I mean, did help some, but not to the extent that I think many people had considered. I'll say one other thing. I mean, I fully agree with Walter, and I love that quote from President Johnson. But for me, I think I wasn't as taken aback or so bent out of joint by the decision, because I expected the decision to come. For me, the biggest disappointment was just the court's refusal to recognize that we're not at a place where there's a level playing field. I mean, that was the most disappointing thing to me. To some extent, I think selective institutions over the years have used affirmative action as a crutch. They haven't done the real work because, I mean, when I came to the University of Richmond, one of the reasons I was attracted to the position was that University of Richmond had become very much more diverse in a short period of time, thanks to my predecessor, Ed Ayers. And so in my inaugural address, what I said to the community was I congratulated them on the great work they had done. But I said, demographic diversity, changing the demographics, that's only the first step. Now we have to ensure that everyone, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, everyone at this institution feels as though they belong here and can take full advantage of all that we have to offer. And that's the real work that universities have to do, And by the way, my daughter, who just got married last year, my daughter made a decision in the 9th grade that she was going to go to an HBCU. And she made that decision because her entire life she'd been at predominantly white institutions. And she said, I want to be at an institution surrounded by people who look like me and who come. And so she ended up going to Hampton, had a great education there. And some of her closest friends are still Hampton folks. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. I think there are some initiatives that PWIs can take. For one, becoming test optional, doing away with the SAT and the ACT. One of the things that I learned when I was at Miami, that I suspected was true, but I learned because Joe Cox, my associate provost, I said to him, because I got into an argument with our president about students with lower ACTs and how well they do in school. And so I asked Joe to do a study for me. And that study revealed that those students ended up doing well at the University at Miami University. The other issue, the other advantage Miami has, you already have the regional campuses. And I know, at least when I was at Miami, there was the notion that some faculty held that students who went to the regional campuses were not as intellectually prepared as those at Miami. And the president of Miami at the time thought the same thing. So again, I had Joe Cox do a study. And you know what we learned? The students from the regional campuses actually graduated then with a higher grade point average than those students who started out at Miami. So, I mean, a lot of the work that we have to do is work that has to do with changing the cultures, changing the mindsets of folks in predominantly white institutions. And one last thing I'll say to you, that we don't talk about a lot, but I'm President Emeritus now, so I can put it out there. One of the secrets that highly selective, particularly selective PWIs with large endowments have, they rely on recruiting and matriculating a certain percentage of full pay students in order to operate. And I'm talking about 35–40% of the students. And those students typically are white, come from upper class families, and typically have not any real experiential base on which to develop relationships across class or across race, for that matter. And so, that's a challenge that we have to face up to and to deal with. And that's one of the impediments in terms of changing the cultures in these institutions.
All right, don't go nowhere, Dr. Crutcher. I'm going to pick on you with this next question. Demographic projections suggest that our country, and by definition, our youth population attending college, are going to be majority minorities within the next 20 years. How might this impact upon the future of universities, PWIs in particular, in your case?
Yeah, it's going to have a big impact. And by the way, that's going to happen at the same time as another phenomenon that we know is coming, and that's the demographic cliff. It will have a real impact on Miami. So we know that by 2026, there's going to be a real drop-off in high school graduates, particularly in the Northeast and in the Midwest. And so that's going to be happening at the same time as we're coming up on this time when we'll become at least high school graduates will be the majority students of color. And again, that points back to something I said previously, and that is it focuses on the urgency for changing the cultures, to ensuring that everyone who comes to your institution feels as though they belong, can take full advantage of everything the institution has to offer. And the only way you do that is to change the culture. And you change the culture, by engaging your students from the very first time I would say even before they come to the institution. And it takes work, and it's not something that you can that's going to happen overnight. It will take time, but the leadership at the university, and this is where presidents come in, the leadership has to make it clear that this is a high priority, for them. And there has to be more than just a priority. They have to have a plan for changing the culture.
Dr. Kimbrough, the same demographic shifts are going to impact upon HBCUs. How might those demographic shifts impact, and what kinds of strategies do HBCUs and their leadership need to take in consideration today to prepare for those shifts?
Yes, I think people are looking at it a lot of different ways in terms of conversations about how do we diversify our enrollments, particularly for more students of color. It depends. I mean, some of the states where HBCUs are, the cliff is not as great. I mean, you have more of a drop off. As Ron said, in the Northeast, you still have some growth in places like Texas and Florida. So there's still some opportunities for students. I think HBCUs are going to have to just compete more directly for some of the students, which I think some of that can happen, and it has been happening. In 2015, at the University of Missouri, you had this major protest that fall by Black students there, just in terms of what was happening on campus. And then all of 2016, we saw, protests all across the country. And I call that the Missouri effect. And actually during that time, I think that 8% of all Black college students attended HBCUs. It's ticked up now at about 9%. So I think even on the heels of, the affirmative action decision, you're going to see even more of that. So I think there's some opportunities for HBCUs just because of the climate. Like Ron said about his daughter, at Dillard, I talk to students all the time who said, I've gone to majority white high schools and elementary schools all my life. I really want to have that experience. And so I think that you have more Black students and parents looking at HBCUs again. So I think there's an opportunity, even with those demographic challenges out there, there is an opportunity now for HBCUs to be more competitive for students that 10 years ago wouldn't have looked at HBCUs. But I think just because of the overall climate in the country, which hasn't gotten any better, and depending upon what happens at the next presidential election, that I think can be a driver for students and families wanting to feel like I need to be in a safe, and that word is used a lot, a safe environment in terms of the campus. So those are things, but I think HBCUs still have to be better at some of the basics. I think sometimes people rely a lot too much on saying, well, we're just going to add graduate programs or online programs. It's like you're not going to out online Southern New Hampshire, which spends a quarter of its budget on marketing. It's just I tell people it sounds good, but if we right now go to their website and type in I'm interested in Southern New Hampshire, by the time we get off the Zoom in 5 minutes, they would have called us saying, hey, can I help you? And none of us are set up to do that. So it's like you can't compete with somebody and just do it halfway when they're all in. So I toss those things out. I think there are some basic things that we can do. And because I think HBCUs sell a unique culture, we should lean into that more. I live in New Orleans. I can't imagine somebody saying we're going to do an online version of Mardi Gras, because that's not going to be fun. I mean, it's not fun if I just throw the beads at the screen. Part of being at Mardi Gras is watching out, because if you don't look, those beads are going to hit you in the face. You can't replicate that. You can't replicate. So we have to lean into what makes that culture unique so that people want that experience as well. So I think those are opportunities, there are lots of opportunities, I think, for HBCUs to do well. And I think that the affirmative action decision will drive some of that for people. Like I said, we've already seen some of that, even though over the last 12 or 13 years in all of higher education, we've seen a decrease. But from last fall to this fall, the National Clearinghouse numbers indicate that HBCU enrollment was up 6%. So, I mean, it's happening. But I think we have to be able to capitalize on that renewed interest in HBCUs and do it well so that continues. But we still have to pay attention to demographics will impact us as well. But I think we're in a position to be much more competitive than we would have been 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Dr. Crutcher, I want you to imagine that you're getting ready to have a conversation with your 19, 20-year-old self today. What would you tell yourself if you could go back in time with all of your wealth of wisdom and knowledge and everything? How would you advise yourself then? What would you tell a young Ron Crutcher?
It's an interesting question. Well, I think most importantly, I mean, one of the things that I've benefited from in my life is having had parents, and particularly a father, who made me always being open to opportunities. And regardless of where they, regardless of the color of the folks who offered the opportunities. And I guess what I would have said to myself at a younger age, at the age of 19, in respect to that, is that don't limit yourself to the opportunities. Be open to going even beyond what you might think you are capable of, or what you might think you want to do. Because early on, I tended to plan out things in a way that was in ways that were unrealistic, I realize now. And be more flexible. Don't be so boxed in. And I have to credit my wife for helping me in that regard, helping me. I'm basically an introvert who masquerades as an extrovert. And my wife is an over-the-top extrovert. And she's helped me to understand and to understand the importance of reaching out to people. Because when I was 19 years old, I would walk down the street, and I would be so busy thinking about things, I wouldn't speak to anybody. I just kind of go, and I share this story with me. Once, when we early in our marriage, we went to my church, Zion Baptist Church in Cincinnati, and my Sunday school teacher, Lucia B. Keys, came. I went past her and I gave her a hug. "Oh, Mrs. Keys, it's so great to see you." And she said, "Oh, I'm surprised that you remember who I am." And afterwards, I said to Betty, "Why would she be surprised? She was my Sunday school teacher. My father used to drive her home after evening service." And Betty said, "Well, she thinks, you've gone off, you went to Yale, to graduate school, you went to Europe on a Fulbright, that you're better than she is." And I said, "But I'm not like that." And Betty said, "She doesn't know that." That was a real eye opener for me. And so I guess I would say to my 19-year-old self, kind of get outside your head, just be more willing and more open to interact with people, just little things, saying hello to people on the street and stuff like that.
Dr. Kimbrough, you've got access to a time machine. You can go back a few years, way, way back, and talk to your 19, 20-year-old self. What would you tell yourself based upon your experiences, successes and failures?
I don't know, because sometimes I do think about that in terms of, how things might be different. I'm a preacher's kid, so part of it is for me that, the way things have happened and what I've learned along the way, I value all that. So part of me doesn't want to do anything different or tell myself anything different, because I think that there's a lot of value in that journey that I've experienced. I think probably like Ron, I would have done some things different, at least academically. Like I would have majored like in sociology or history, because my degree was in biology. I thought I was going to be a veterinarian. So that would have been different, because I started leaning towards some of those things. Probably if I were really to go back, and like I said, the way things happen, the friends I've made and those things, I wouldn't really change it. But if I were to do anything differently, which would have fundamentally changed me as a person, it would have gone back 2 years before that. As a senior in high school, I would have applied to and gone to Morehouse. And one of the main reasons is I'm just tired of people who, when they meet me and they know I'm from Atlanta, assume I went to Morehouse. So I keep telling them, like, when am I going to get an honorary degree? Because everybody assumes I went to Morehouse. I fit. And so then working there for a year, I was like, dang, it took me long enough. I'm finally a Morehouse man, even just for a year. So that would be probably the only thing, because I think I could have had some different kinds of experiences that I think could have been powerful. But like I said, I wouldn't change anything about the friendships I made at the University of Georgia and going to Miami and all of that. I think all that happened the way that it should. So I'm thankful for that. But the thing I always do think about is like how things would have been different had I gone to Morehouse.
Hold on to the mic, Dr. Kimbrough, as you look at where we're at right now, this place we are in the world and in America, and particularly in our institutions. What would you tell today's youth, knowing what is before them? What advice would you give them to deal with these current realities?
Yeah, that's interesting. One of my former students is now a second-year law student at the University of Florida. He called me this morning because he's frustrated because he doesn't feel, he's always been like this, he doesn't feel like his peers understand the moment that we're in, and to address issues, particularly issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As I said, he's in Florida, so they're catching it, and he's working with the boss there and trying to get law students, and he just feels like too many of his generation are just trying to, obtain things, wealth and status and that, and people aren't willing to make those sacrifices. And so I want people to understand much more the sacrifices that have been made And we need a new generation of people who are willing to make those kinds of sacrifices. I wrote a piece recently just saying, let's cancel King Day for next year, because we focus too much on this sort of mythical Martin Luther King Jr. We never talk about how he gave away all of that Nobel Prize money, even though his family really could have used it. We don't have people making those kind of sacrifices. And if we're going to address the real challenges that facing us now and that will face us in the future, there going to have to be some people who are willing to make some sacrifices for the greater good, and not be so individualistic. And so for people to have courage, and King talked a lot about, sacrifice. He gave a speech in 1959 at the University of Iowa. He talked about sacrifice a lot. And that's not a part of the narrative of King that we talk about. And so I hope we talk about what people have to sacrifice to continue the gains that, have been handed to that next generation. So that's what I really hope, that, we have some people who are thinking bigger picture, thinking about the broader community, and how do we fight for, and to maintain the gains and not lose things that, we're seeing attempts to erode every day. Ohio is a battleground for a lot of those issues. Just had to vote there, related to abortion and marijuana, but you look at gerrymandering of districts and all those kinds of things that are happening. So that's what I would really encourage young people, that, we didn't fight. I mean, that's why you got the affirmative action situation that we have right now, because people were so upset about, Hillary Clinton talking about super predators. And so now the real super predators on the Supreme Court, and they're eating up affirmative action, and they're empowering people like Bloom. And we talked about this a little earlier, the impact of affirmative action. It's not just, people getting into college. He's going after pipeline programs. So if you want to have a program that helps Black students go to law school, they're suing, saying you can't do that. It's got to be open to everyone. Or the Fearless Fund in Atlanta, who want to help Black women who want to get into venture capital, and suing for that. You can't have, even though Black women are getting a portion of 1% of venture capital, you can't do that. Those are the things people are missing. They're just focusing on college admissions. He's going after everything. And that's what we've got. So they can't just sit back, because if you sit back, you aren't going to have anything. And I don't think that there is a level of urgency that there needs to be to address those things.
Dr. Crutcher, many believe that we're at this inflection point where multiple problems and issues are confronting, particularly our young people. What advice would you give our young students today?
Well, I mean, I agree with what Walter just said, and I would add to that, in addition to having courage, to have a real understanding of the role that they play in sustaining our democracy. That, American democracy, Americans liberal democracy, is not. It's not a finished product. I mean, it's not a fully fledged adult. At best, American democracy is an emerging adult, and young people need to understand the important role that they play in ensuring that our democracy is sustained, and that includes being willing to have difficult conversations and encounters with other folks with whom you don't agree. Being willing, I mean, that takes courage, obviously, and courage, openness, the ability to think. All of those attributes are critically important if we're going to be able to sustain our democracy. And Walter is very, very right. This next election I think will be an important inflection point for us as a country. And I'm not certain that, well, let's put it this way. I want young people to understand the critically important role that they will play, particularly those who are able to vote in that next election, and to be engaged in ways that work for them, in ensuring that that their peers vote and are engaged in the next election as well.
Historically, within the African community and culture, both in Africa and the diaspora in this country, elders have played a significant role. I think we're in a point where the wisdom of our elders is even more needed today. Du Bois talked about a talented tenth. What role do you see, starting with you, Dr. Crutcher, for our elders, our talented tenth right now? What you know, you neither one of you can retire. I'm going to tell you that right now. That's not going to happen. Okay. You're too valuable a commodity and a resource to go someplace and lay on a beach. So I'm telling you right now, that's not going to happen. So as you plan your future, I need to know three things that's on your agenda to make a difference.
Well, I mean, for me, I continued. I'm a president emeritus, so I'm continuing to work with students in our university at the University of Richmond. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a university that has we have about 28, 29% students of color, but we still have a way to go to achieve the goal of becoming a truly inclusive intercultural community in which everyone feels as though they belong. And so I'm working with our students on those issues. I'm also working at the Aspen Institute with new presidents, trying to help them understand the importance of their roles as leaders of these institutions, of the importance of their roles and helping their the powers that be within their institution develop the resources that will eventually help change the cultures in the institutions, so they can ensure that all students in the institutions feel as though they can thrive in that in those institutions. And then I continue to mentor students one-on-one. My wife and I have had a mentoring group since we were at Miami in 1999. I have a group of young men, and my wife has a group of young women. And while it's a multiracial group, I always am sure that I have a number of men of color in that group, and they get special attention from me because they need this special attention and helping them as they develop into young men.
Dr. Kimbrough, you are way too valuable a resource to retire. That's not going to happen. We need you. Tell me, as you look forward to the next few years, what's on your agenda? What's on your horizon?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure it out. I want to do another presidency. I'm at a point where I'm trying to figure out if I stay in the HBCU space or if I look at a predominantly white institution. It's just, I think there is value in both spaces, and there is a need, particularly predominantly white institutions, for authentic Black leadership. I think that's important too for everybody there. So those kinds of things, continue to work with people who aspire to be presidents. I want to try to figure out how do we come up with some way for board reform. You mentioned earlier just the turnover with HBCUs. A lot of that is board driven. We've got to have board reform. And so I want to be a part of figuring out how do we do that, because I think if we can reform boards, we can have better tenures, particularly at HBCUs. And HBCUs are not, they're not the only institutions that are dealing with, some sudden exits. I mean, Ron talked about, with working with ACE and, the latest survey, the average tenure is now, 5.9 years. Back in 2004, when we both became presidents, it was close to 9. So, you just see how much that's dropped off. It's a lot. So it's an epidemic all over the place. But those are the kinds of things I want to work on. But right now, I'm just at that point, as I, while I am considering options, for me, it's like, where should I be? And so I don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay. Thank you. I am now going to turn it over to Seth and to Bethany to close us out. I want to thank you very much for your wisdom and your insight.
Thank you. I certainly enjoyed the conversation. Definitely learned a few things from that conversation. So we did have a lot of questions that came in for pre-registered questions about the direction of Miami. We do have some great diversity programs here, and have won awards and things of that nature. But also, honestly, we have had some challenges, pre and post, as recruiting diverse populations of students to Miami. And so folks want to know, Bethany, who leads our admissions program, can you let us know what is Miami's plans going forward, given the decision from the Supreme Court?
First of all, I could have just attended this webinar and not been a part of it and been honored. It was wonderful to learn from you both and hear your stories the past hour. But I love what you said, Dr. Crutcher, about doing the real work, and that institutions who are going to move forward positively have to do the real work. And I'm grateful that at Miami University we've been doing the real work for some time, and that's where our programs are winning awards. The programs like the Bridges program, which is an immersive overnight experience for students who will contribute to or embrace diversity on our campus. And that being said, we are still challenged with a lower percentage than we would like of students of color here on our campus, and a stigma and a reputation that I think very often does not reflect the reality of the Miami University of 2023. So there are a few things that we have in place, and I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that came in as I share that. One of the questions that came in referred to a declining percentage of students of color, particularly African-American students on Miami's campus. And what are we doing to impact that decline? So first, I want to share that the percentage is actually not declining. At Miami, we took a hit in 2020, along with many other predominantly white institutions with African-American students attending Miami. But that percentage has gone up the past couple of years. The challenge for us is that we've gone up single-digit percentages in the number of Black or African-American students attending Miami University, while the number of students that we're admitting has gone up over 50% in the past couple of years. So what we are seeing is students are applying. Even this year, I was very concerned with the SCOTUS decision that we would see a decline in students of color applying to Miami University. Even this year, we are significantly up in students of color across races and ethnicity applying to Miami University. They're applying. They're admitted. And based on our modeling, it projects that we will have a strong number of admits, even while being race neutral in our review. But as students have more options, really strong options, and as discount rates go up at institutions, the challenge is yielding students, getting these wonderful admitted students to enroll. So there is good news and bad news here. We have the opportunity, with the number of applications and the number of students that we will even admit in a race neutral environment, to grow the number of Black or African-American students and other students from other underrepresented races at Miami University. We will have the pool of students. It's going to be getting them to campus and really showing them that they belong, reflecting a culture that is accurate. I like to say giving non-admission-y answers to admission questions so that students have a real picture of what they're going to see. And that means a few different initiatives. So there are some things we're already doing and some things that we're going to lean more into. And Seth, is it okay that I'm listing these off?
Go ahead.
Specific questions for me.
Yes.
But first of all, we have strong partnerships. We have a partnership with the Cincinnati Public Schools, and that's allowed us to grow the population of students coming from that particular district, supporting students with finances, with programming, with a network of support when they arrive on campus. So not just throwing scholarship dollars to try and recruit students, but really focusing on building relationships with teachers and with counselors and with staff in the Cincinnati area, and recruiting those students earlier in the process. Early outreach is going to be key. And we are looking at opportunities to replicate partnerships like that one in other large metro areas, starting with inside Ohio, in the Columbus, Cleveland, and Dayton areas. We also will continue to offer our immersive experiences, and we hope to expand capacity. So we have the Summer Scholars Program, which is a week-long camp opportunity where students take classes and participate in activities with each other. We have the Bridges Program, which is an overnight program for seniors. And there's an opportunity for us to offer scholarships for students to attend to the Summer Scholars Program as rising juniors and seniors over the summer, as well as opportunities to expand the capacity of our Bridges program. I say this because students who attend these kinds of immersive experiences and really get a sense of belonging and start to build relationships, they come to Miami at a rate of more like 40 to 50% compared to a rate of more like 15% of our overall student body. So it shows the value of showing students that they belong and helping them build community early on. I would be remiss to say, though, that it's just about showing them that they'll belong. It's about building relationships. We also have to put our money where our mouth is. And we cannot just say we want students and not show them in scholarship opportunities and funding to get them to campus, both before they apply and as they're admitted students. We have a particular challenge with where we're located as a predominantly white institution, and with a reputation of being less affordable than we are. We have wonderful programs in place, fantastic scholarships for students. So our teams are doing the real work of building relationships with counselors, CBOs, teachers, to say we need to make students aware of these opportunities and get them to campus. So I think it's going to be highly relational, and it's going to involve partnerships that cover more than just a scholarship or just a program, but really help students build community and belonging before they get here.
Well, thank you so much, Bethany, for answering the questions. I want to make sure I end it here. I know we got a time crunch here, but we thank all of our participants, our esteemed alumni, Dr. Crutcher and Dr. Kimbrough, who are experts from both perspectives of the issue. And I think we've learned a lot today from them and also from Bethany as far as direction that Miami is going. And thank you, Dr. Coates, for moderating the discussion as well. So we encourage folks to continue to tune in to Miami University's webinar platform. We'll continue to offer great discussions such like this and others as we move forward. So thank you again for watching, and love and honor.
Thank you.